Hi, this is Dr. Cassidy. And as we approach the end of the semester, I want us to take a look at two contrasting short stories. They're written 50 miles apart and 50 years apart. And the second one, Those Who Stay and Fight, was very much written as a spiritual sequel to the first one, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So let's talk about that. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's a short story writer written by Ursula LeGuin. Le Guin was a writer in the science fiction writer in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, who towards the end of her life achieved what I would call mainstream success. In the 1960s, she was one of a handful of writers who were sort of reinventing science fiction, one of very few female writers at the time, female science fiction writers, who received widespread acclaim within the field. She had a background in cultural anthropology. If you have seen the movie Dune and its sequel, Dune Part 2, that's based on Frank Herbert. Frank Herbert and Ursula Le Guin were, at the time of the 1960s, often compared because they both had won the same major awards, and they both were writers who focused on kind of an anthropological understanding of future outer space societies. Okay, so that's Ursula Le Guin. The story that we're focusing on, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, was written in 1973. And again, let's remember 1973. It was the year that saw the end of the U.S. active participation in the Vietnam War. America signed the peace treaty and said the war is over. The war was not over. But the troops came home, the draft was ended, and Watergate was in full swing, the Watergate crisis, or was about to be. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. I mention all of that because the story is about a seemingly idyllic society. It's a strange story, and I'm just going to take you through it a little bit. It begins as this sort of tour guide. We get this vivid description of a day of celebration. It's not sure who is talking to whom. Joyous. How is one to tell about joy? How to describe the citizens of Omelas? They were not simple folk, you see, though they were happy. That word "you" is doing a lot of work there. We're talking, the narrator is talking to somebody as if telling them, I said it's like a tour guide, but telling a stranger who doesn't know about Omelas, about the town. I repeat, these were not simple folk, not dulcet shepherds, noble savages, bland utopians. They were not less complex than us. Who is this us? They were not barbarians. All of this is talking about barbarians, noble savages. All of that is an indication of the way Westerners have often talked about the people who they seem as less than. In other words, barbarians, noble savages. These are Western tropes for talking about non-Western people. How can I tell you about the people of Omelas? They were not naive and happy children, though the children were in fact happy. They were mature, intelligent, passionate adults whose lives were not wretched. Oh, miracle! And then it takes a kind of darker turn. Do you accept the festival of the city, the joy? No? Then let me describe one more thing. In a basement under one of the beautiful public buildings of Omelas, or perhaps in the cellar of one of its spacious private homes, there is a room. It has one locked door and no window. A little light seeps in dustily between the cracks in the boards, second hand from a cobwebbed window. Skipping down, the floor is dirt, a little damp to the touch, as cellar dirt usually is. And in this room, there is a child. The people at the door never say anything, but the child, who has not always lived in the tool room, can remember sunlight and its mother's voice, sometimes speaks. The child speaks. I will be good, it says. Please let me out. I will be good. They never answer. The child used to scream for help at night and cry a good deal, but now only makes a kind of whining, and speaks less and less often. They all know it is there, all the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it. Others are content merely to know it is there. They all know it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not. They all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. Okay, and the story does not hold back from discussing it. And then it ends. At times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who see the child does not go home or weep or rage, does not, in fact, go home at all. Sometimes also a man or a woman much older falls silent for a day or two, then leaves home. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out of the city of Omelas, through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands of Omelas. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Night falls. The traveler must pass down village streets between the houses with yellow-lit windows and on out into the darkness of the fields. Each alone they go west or north towards the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas. They walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is impossible that it does not. It is possible it does not exist. But they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. And there is no shortage of really excellent criticism, including YouTube videos, trying to unpack this extremely short story. There was a great episode of the third season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which they didn't call it Omelas, but they took this idea that there is a city of happiness which lives by putting a child in a chair until that child dies a horrible, gruesome, painful death. They live off of the death of a child, one child at a time. And the writers made no bones about the fact that, yes, they were borrowing liberally from an idea from Ursula LeGuin. So what is the story about? Well, I mean, growing up, I barely remember the 1960s. As I said, she was a writer who came of age as a writer in the 1960s. But the Vietnam War had just ended, And I always took this story not as a direct moral about the Vietnam War, but a story about the kinds of trade-offs that people make. In other words, think about a wartime situation where, think about the Vietnam War. America was, in the 1960s, the most prosperous country the world had ever seen. I think that's a title we probably have reclaimed a few times. Was the happiest? Well, that's so open to interpretation. But the most prosperous in many ways, yes. But built on the basis of what? During the 1960s, there was no shortage of images of the suffering of children from the Vietnam War. Now, again, I don't see the story as a parable about the Vietnam War, but I think it's built on that problem. In other words, what does an insanely happy and incredibly wealthy society base its happiness on? Well, if you go back in American society, you can say, well, a lot of the wealth was built on slavery, and it was. Slavery was a trade in children initially. Most of the children who survived the most of the people who survived the Middle Passage were quite young, because people over 30 did not survive the Middle Passage. Much of the wealth of America was originally created out of slavery. Again, I don't want to say it's strictly a parable about slavery. Rather, it's this kind of catch-all philosophical dilemma. How wrong does it be? Back to the idea of the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, thousands of Americans were leaving. We talked about draft dodgers, people who hid up in Canada for the Vietnam War. A lot of people just moved and never came back. They didn't know where they were going necessarily. They knew they were not going to be a part of this. The moral situation of Americans during the Vietnam War seems to have provided this very complex philosophical parable. You know, the narrator, it's not clear, is the narrator somebody who still lives in Omelas? And the relationship to the reader is something, in other words, the reader is challenged implicitly, which would you be? And also, walking away from Omelas. Is that enough? Is that what you do? Do you just walk away? If you're a conscientious objector? Okay, so as I said, I don't believe this is a short story based narrowly about the moral dilemmas of the Vietnam War. But when you see that, you identify slavery, you identify these other moral dilemmas. Today, a lot of American wealth is built on child labor. Children who work in factories in India and China for 12, 13-hour days. It wasn't written about them, but as I said, it's a parable which lends itself to a lot of different examples. So that was written in 1973. In 2018, I said 50 years later, it's really 45, but 50 is such a round number. N.K. Jemison, who is a black female writer, wrote a kind of sequel. I said a spiritual sequel. She called it The Ones Who Stay and Fight. And notice the similarity. It is a good day. It is the day of good birds in the city of Umelas. The day is a local custom, silly and random as so many local customs can be, and yet beautiful at the same token. So again, we seem to be walking into this insanely happy, insanely successful city. Omelas sits at a confluence of 3 rivers and an ocean. But this city is no awkward dystopia. Dystopia, as you probably know, means a deeply flawed society. It is the opposite of utopia, which is a seemingly perfect society. This is not a city in which people are forced to conform. This is a city of joy. But is there any darkness? Yes, there is. What have I forgot to mention? Oh, it is the thing that will seem most fantastic to you, friend. The variety, the citizens of Omelas, and so many other wildly different in appearance and origin and development. People in this land come from many others, and it shows in sheen of skin and kink of hair and plumpness of lip and hip. If one wanders the streets, where the workers and artisans do their work, there are slightly more people with dark skin. If one strolls the corridors of Executive Tower, there are a few extra done in pale. Does that seem wrong to you? It shouldn't. And she's going to talk about the children. There is evil in Omelas. Sometimes there is murder. Some people begin to perceive that ours is a world where the notion that some people are less important than others has been allowed to take root. And they wonder, how could they, gleaners exclaim? Why would they do such things? How could they just leave those people to starve? Why do they not listen when that one complains of disrespect? And that evil spreads. Sometimes there's murder. Social workers from Omelas stand talking now over the body of a dead man. He is dead, early, unwilling, with a beautiful plastic pike jammed through his spine and heart. Beside the man's body crouches a little girl. She heard him say, "I'm sorry." She saw the social workers show the only mercy possible. She isn't old enough to have been warned of the consequences of breaking the law, or to understand her father knew those consequences and accepted them. "I'll get back at you," she says between sobs. "I'll make you die the way you made him die." The social workers exchange looks of concern. Now, so far it seems like we're walking down that path that Omelas walked into, where we have this seemingly perfect society, or at least a very well-functioning society. There is this girl who has been deeply hurt by her father's death. Poor child, she's nearly septic with the taint of our world. Nearly. But then our social worker, the tall brown one, who got 100 strangers to smile at a handmade ladybug, crouches and offers a hand to the child. What? That surprises you? Did you think this would end with a cold slaughter of a child? There are other options. And that is Umelas, friend. Even a pitiful, deceased child matters. They'll keep her in quarantine and reach out to her for several days. There's only one toxic treatment for this toxin once it gets into the blood, fighting it tooth and nail, spear and claw. And you fight the toxin of hate, not through hate, not by walking away, but through tender love. Those who stand and fight are social workers. Don't walk away. The child needs you. Don't you see? You have to fight for her. Now that you know she exists, walking away is meaningless. Here, take my hand. Take it. Please. Good, good. Now let's get to work. Now that is a hopeful story. I want to take a moment to talk about a term you may have heard, Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism has been applied to N.K. Jemison. It's a term that a lot of the writers who have it applied to them have trouble with. But the idea of Afrofuturism is it's a hopeful idea of the future, focusing on Black African American viewpoints. In other words, rather than taking kind of a Star Trek, not that there's anything wrong with Star Trek, I love Star Trek view of the future. How would Black folk imagine the future? That's at the core of Afrofuturism, but not in a narrow sense. And that's what I think is happening in Those Who Stay and Fight. In other words, this is a hopeful view of the future which the world will not be perfect. It never was and never will be. But there will always be those who stand and fight for the young people, who offer hope when the situation could get hopeless. Because as the narrator asks, what's the alternative? War? Walking away? No, staying and fight. Staying and fighting. But fighting in this case does not mean with guns. It means with care, with concerns, with hands. When I was growing up, I just mentioned Star Trek. Star Trek was kind of the hopeful view of the future. It inspired, among many others, Octavia Butler, to the point that one of her novels she pulled from publication long after it was published, because she said it was basically just her attempt to write a Star Trek novel. I haven't read it because it's so hard to find. That was a hopeful view of the future, based around Gene Roddenberry and his writers. Gene Roddenberry was ex-Navy. He worked briefly as a policeman. So, basically a centrist, white American view of the future. The Once Walk Away from Omelas strikes me as the kind of society that, Captain Kirk would go into and say, we gotta change. Those Who Stay and Fight, that represents, I think, kind of a multicultural view of the future based on, I think, what the writer N.K. Jemison sees around her. It was published in a book called How Long Till Black Future Month, And I think that gives you a good idea of who she is. Okay, so putting this in the context of this course altogether, we began by thinking about the hopeful message of the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty, which, thanks to the poem by Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, poem written by a Jewish woman, it was made into the stand as this kind of utopian symbol for America that would be inclusive. And we have seen, as the literature of America both tried to and sometimes failed to rise up to that level of inclusiveness. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is kind of a story saying it's casting doubt on the idea of American exceptionalism, which was a term used in much of the 20th century for the idea that America might be a special place. On the other hand, the story of those who stay and fight, that story is saying, no, the future is still there. It's still ours to be written. We can write it together. So it's a beautiful story for us to look at towards the end of the semester.